So today, let's deconstruct a world built on just three things: land, loyalty, and the sword. We're talking about feudal Japan, which from the 1100s to the 1800s created this incredibly unique and powerful society that, honestly, shaped its culture for centuries. So how on earth did this society actually work? Well, let's break it down.
Okay, what's so fascinating right off the bat is that power here wasn't based on some complex legal system like in other empires. Nope, it was all about personal bonds, about military strength and this unbreakable promise of loyalty between a lord and his warrior. And this created a really interesting and, yeah, often brutal social dynamic.
To really wrap our heads around this world, we've got to start with the ground it was built on. Japan's geography isn't just a pretty backdrop. It's the fundamental reason its whole feudal system even happened in the first place.
See, Japan is an archipelago, which is really just a fancy way of saying it's a chain of islands. And this simple fact did two huge things. One, it kept communities inside Japan separated. And two, more importantly, it pretty much cut off the entire nation from the rest of the world.
And this quote just nails it, right? This isolation meant Japan could develop its own unique culture, its own art, its own way of doing things with almost zero outside influence. It was a world all its own. But that isolation came with a massive internal problem. And that problem really comes down to this one number: 80%. That's how much of Japan is covered in mountains, which means there was an extreme shortage of the one thing every society needs to survive: flat land you can actually farm on.
And this right here is the absolute key. In that kind of environment, rice was way more than just dinner. It was money. It was the entire economy. Controlling a rice paddy wasn't just about feeding your family. It was about controlling wealth and having real power.
So this constant fight for control over this super scarce, super valuable land meant they needed a system, a way to manage it all and protect it. And this is exactly where the feudal structure starts to bubble up, born right out of the landscape itself.
So how did they deal with this constant battle for land? Well, the answer is in their social structure. Feudal Japan was set up like a really rigid pyramid, where every single person had a very specific job and a very specific place.
But this pyramid, it wasn't just about who was in charge. It was this complicated web of what you owed to other people. You can see how each level supports the one above it, and the glue holding the entire thing together was that one idea we started with: loyalty.
So way up at the top, you've got the emperor. He was super respected, kind of like a god, but had no real political power. The guy actually running the show was the shogun, the top military boss. He gave land to these powerful lords called daimyo, and they, in turn, hired samurai warriors to protect it. And then at the very bottom, holding the whole thing up, were the peasants, the ones growing all that incredibly important rice.
These daimyo were basically the regional kings, and their power was shown off by these massive castles. These weren't just houses. They were fortresses. They were government buildings. They were the physical proof of their control over the land and everyone on it.
So if you boil it all down, the whole system really just worked on a simple trade. The shogun and daimyo gave out land and protection. And in return, the samurai and peasants gave them military service, hard labor, and, most importantly, their absolute unwavering loyalty.
All right, now we have to talk about the most iconic figures of this whole period, the samurai. Because they were so much more than just soldiers. They were kind of like the moral and military engine that made the whole system go.
The word samurai itself tells you everything you need to know. It literally translates to those who serve. Their entire reason for being was defined by their service to a master, who was usually a daimyo.
But here's what's so wild about them, this duality. Of course, a samurai was expected to be a master of the sword, an absolutely lethal warrior, but at the same time he was also expected to be cultured, to study poetry and art and literature. And this wasn't just a hobby. This balance of warrior and scholar is what made them such effective leaders, able to both conquer a region and then govern it, bringing stability for their lord.
And the rule book for all this was a philosophical code called Bushido, the way of the warrior. Now, this wasn't some single book of laws you could look up. It was more like a living, evolving moral compass that guided how a samurai should live, fight, and ultimately die.
Bushido was built on all these virtues you see here, things like courage, respect, and discipline. But the single most important one, the one that topped everything else, was absolute loyalty to your master. That loyalty was more important than your family, more important than money, even more important than your own life.
To really put this all in perspective, it helps to compare the samurai to a warrior you might be a little more familiar with, the European knight. On the surface, they seem pretty similar, but their whole purpose and philosophy were actually worlds apart.
Let's just break it down. A knight's armor was that heavy, full-plate metal. They were basically walking tanks. A samurai's armor, though, was lighter, made for speed and agility. And while a knight's code of chivalry was all about protecting the weak, Bushido was laser-focused on loyalty and duty to your lord. So at the end of the day, their goals were just fundamentally different.
And that brings us right back to the beginning, doesn't it? From the mountains that made land so precious, to that social pyramid built on duty, to the warrior code that demanded absolute loyalty, every single piece of feudal Japan was connected, built on the strength of these personal bonds.
Which kinda leaves us with one last question to think about. In a world where land is everything, and loyalty is the law, what does it truly mean to be a warrior? Is your purpose to serve a master, or a code, or maybe something else entirely? The world of the samurai gives us one very powerful answer.